last week, we briefly went through what user study is and what types of methods you can use with your user study, and how that relates to the HCI research process. So we've briefly covered what each of the research methods are, although we are going to be going to a little bit more details for each of them, some of the methods in the latter of the lectures. And today I think we're going to cover especially the usability testing, which is quite at the bottom here. Anyway, that's kind of what we've talked about last time. We went through each of them. And we also talked a little bit more about what kind of results or outputs we are expecting from this kind of user testing or user study. And the outcome will be mainly the feedback from the users, either in a quantitative way or in a qualitative way. So we've briefly went through how these feedbacks differ from each other. And also we talked a little bit about how objective measures differ from subjective measures. So objective measures are those you can observe and measure and compare against the standardized scale. And subjective measures are based on users' opinion, so they have to reply in their own verbal description or giving a rating or rank for each of the design choices and so forth. And we briefly covered what are the objective measures and subjective measures could be, and them. So continuing on from where we left from last time, since user study is working with users, there are some certain ethical and privacy issues involving. So it's quite important to be aware of that aspect before you actually design or conduct a user study, so that you won't run into trouble. So users who are participating in your user studies are called participants, of course. So there are different terms that you can use: users, participants, subjects. Sometimes you call them, but usually participants is the kind of most safest ways to present them, because if you just say users, it sounds like just the general users you have outside, which is not related to your user study. If you say subjects, it might be a little bit uncomfortable calling human as subjects. Sounds like a little bit like you're doing some serious human experiment. In many of the cases, calling them participants is kind of a convenient way to call them. Refer to them as somebody participating in your user study. These participants are the representative of the larger population, which is the whole of the end user you are expecting to use your end product or your user interface. So it's in some ways a sample of your whole end user, and in statistical way we call them population. The whole end user is called population, and the participants, which is a subset of those population, is called sample when you are dealing with them in a statistical way or statistical tool. So those are the terms used in statistics, but not necessary to use them, but sometimes you'll see them in a textbook or
So you can say you're taking a sample of 10 people?
Yep, your sample size is 10 people. Yeah. So, or you can just say you had 10 participants. It's the same thing that you are saying, but participants is more from I would say, it's more emphasizing that it's a user study. So sample could be a user or whatever. It's a statistical term or experimental term, so it could be human subjects, or if you are in a forestry, sometimes could be samples as well. So sometimes it could be confusing. But anyway, those are the terms they use in a statistical way. So just don't panic when you read those terms. When in the ACI research, you can, if you read sample, then you can easily think those are the users that were participating in the user study. And so since it's a subset of your whole population, and your user study is to, the final end goal is to know actually how the whole population or the whole end user will accept your user interface. So it has to be somehow, the results you find from your participants or your sample needs to be able to generalize to the whole user population. So it's quite important to how many participants you recruit and how you sample them from the whole population. So is it going to be taking, if, for instance, if you're designing a user interface for kids, then obviously you'll have to sample from the kids rather than the wider range of age. So it's quite important to plan how to recruit your participants and how many of them you're going to recruit, so that the results from your user study could be generalized into wider public. And in some ways, this also involves statistics tools that can tell you how many of the participants you might need to have a certain level of conclusion, certainty of the conclusion. So we'll talk about those later when we talk about the statistical tool we use in HCA research. Okay. And so when you are reporting about your user study, you should also report how did you selected or recruited your participants and how many of them you recruited. And you might also need to report some of the demographic information, such as their gender, age group, or their previous experience with computer, and so forth. So those kind of things you might have to report in the user study at the end of the, as a part of the result of the user study, so that people will know what kind of participants you had and what were their background and so forth. So how many participants? In general, we can say don't worry, it's better, of course. So if you want to generalize your results from your user study, it's the best if you can test the whole users you're going to end up with. But of course, obviously, it's not practical. And in that sense, it all depends on different aspects of your user study, such as what kind of method you are using and what is your intended end users and so forth. And it all depends on the purpose of the testing and the stage of the project. So if you are at the early stage of your project and you are trying to quickly validate some of the design choices, then might be just a couple of users you just quickly test. But if you're going to validate it at the end of your project against to a certain standard, then maybe it's a good idea to have more participants and so forth. So, and it also depends on the method you are going to use. So usually fewer participants are accepted for qualitative studies, such as when you're doing observation or interview, you might end up with lesser people than you do more formal user studies, or even with the case of ethnographic study, which is you go and mingle with the end users and you observe them, how do they task, you might end up with just having one or just a couple of end users, because ethnographic study usually takes quite a long time. So, and the qualitative studies in overall takes quite a longer time compared to structured user experiments. So usually people accept even if you end up with just few of the users in this kind of studies. But it doesn't necessarily mean fewer participants you'll end up with shorter time of your study because these studies takes longer time. And with the usability study, which we'll be talking later on today's lecture, there is a report from Nielsen, who is one of the big names in usability testing field. He usually says 5 usability experts will be able to cover 80% of the usability problem. And this is, we'll see how this might not be appropriate for research purposes, but usability study, in short, is more focused on finding out the problems you have in your prototype or in your product. So it's slightly different from academic research in HCI, but more focusing on how to pick the problems or errors in your system. And in that case, you do a usability testing. And actually, that word should be more like a usability testing, I guess, rather than a study. So in that case, it's usually said that 5 or more usability experts will find out most of the problems. So, and in experimental study, such as if you have different user interface design and you want to compare them and have a kind of statistics results that compares which you can reach into a conclusion which user interface is better than which. It depends on how much of your effect size, which is a difference between the observation. So if it's a test completion time, then if it's going to be the two groups going to have like 10 seconds of difference, might require more people than if you're expecting like an hour of difference, obviously. So it might depend on how much of difference you are looking at between the groups, and those are depending on the statistical tools that you're using. But in general, most of the HCI papers ends up with certain number of participants around 20. So usually if you do less than 15, such as if it's around 10, then usually the reviewer get back to you saying the sample size is too small. And usually if it's around 20, then usually it's accepted in the research field. But again, it's not. This is just a rule of thumb, so it's not a definite number that you end up with. And also it depends on the number of conditions. So if you have more number of conditions, then maybe you'll need more participants to compare them, and so forth. We'll go a little bit more into details of how to decide your number of participants later on when we talk about the statistic tools. But anyway, as a rule of thumb, you can easily expect could be like 15 to 20 when you're doing experimental study.
You need to use all the users that you give to help.
Sorry?
So you said you could use 1 to 2 users if it's a qualitative study. But if you were doing like an experimental study and you want to do a qualitative study, do you have to use all the data you get, or because if you run out of time to do a qualitative study?
So qualitative studies. So still within the experimental study, you can have kind of brief qualitative studies, such as brief interviews. With qualitative studies here, meaning a little bit more longer term studies rather than just interviewing your user for like half an hour or so. That's referring to these qualitative studies we are meaning here. So it's kind of more like longer term study. You visit different peoples and do an extensive amount of interview or survey and so forth. So that's what means. So still you can involve some of the qualitative methods, such as interviewing or doing a survey with the experimental study. But that's more, you're still using qualitative methods, but those are more kind of a subset of your experimental study, but rather considered as a qualitative study as itself. Okay. And And again, so these are some of the factors that you might have to consider when you decide how many participants you want. So it might depend on the statistical power, which we'll maybe look a little bit more into details when we talk about statistical tools, and might depending on the participant group you are expecting. So if your end user is a kind of an expert, such as medical doctors, then it might be a little bit tricky to recruit quite a lot of numbers of medical experts. So in that case, you might end up with smaller number of users, in participants in your user study. But since it has a special kind of constraint to recruit people, it might be acceptable to have lesser amount of people than targeting general public. And also, time constraint might be a problem as well. So when you're running a study and you have to hand in your report in at a certain due date, then that might be also one thing you'll have to think of, how many participants you will end up. Might think of those as well. And of course, besides the time, you might also have some financial resources you might have to think of as well. And how to find the right participants. So this is how to sample your participants from the whole end user you have. So this, of course, starts with looking at your goals and research questions you had. So if your research goal or your user interface was designed for a certain target users, then of course your participants should be a subset of your target participants. Talked about the age group before. And if your solution is to be useful for kind of general public, then it's not wise to just choose participants from the university students, which is actually a subset of the whole population of your user study, your end user. So you should think of what kind of end user you are expecting, and what kind of research questions or goals you have with your user study. So for instance, if you are really targeting the wider range of age, then you might want to sample some participants from kids, some participants from a certain range of age. So you might want to have a even amount of samples from each representative age group and so forth. So other than that, so these are some of other factors, such as it might depend on the cultural or educational background of the end users you are targeting for, or how much of the expertise of the end users you are expecting, or gender and age and so forth. So so since it depends on your this kind of user's background, there are certain strategies to sample the users. So the most widely and most ideal case of sampling your participant is to do a random sampling. So if you have a population or your final end user, then to randomly sample, which means every member in that population will have the same chance of being a participant. So that's the ideal case of sampling your participants in your user study. But in many cases, that might not be easily doable, such as if you're designing an app for the whole world, then you cannot really random sample from the whole world, from different countries and different people and so forth. So that might not be ideal, but in terms of a statistical problem we are facing, it's more ideal if you can give more chance to the whole population than focusing on a certain group of people. So another alternative way is to stratify your sampling, as we've mentioned earlier, that if you're targeting to cover the whole age group, then you might want to group certain range of ages, and then you can take some samples for the younger age group and take some samples from the older age group and so forth. And you can also match the amount of samples or participants you are taking from the percentage of the expected age range of the whole population. So here's another example saying that maybe if the population of the end user, the whole end user, if we say, having the same problem. Hello. Having this problem again. Maybe I'll just have to fall back again to this. And it's not there anymore. Oh well, this will.
So Christoph's one works with the other HTML identity.
The PDF due this Friday, and you have to present it online.
Oh, you mean this assignment? Supposed to?
One thing that could do is we can all just get together and get one of those and their own stacks.
Yeah, what stacks? Let's do. What's at the bottom of it then? How do you think?
Look at how they.
Stand it on whatever that whiteboard's on.
Yeah. Is that A0? Yeah.
So it might be wider. Stick it.
Okay. City time, maybe later.
Did you switch the HDMI cable? It says it's on the HDMI. Okay. This is colors up.
Well, just continue. I wonder when we'll not have this problem. So again, back to the stratified sampling. So for example, if your whole population, say 38% of your whole population college students, then maybe you can have 38% of your participant as a college student, and so forth. So, and the other thing, which usually happens, but it's thing to avoid, is convenience or accidental sampling, which is kind of just recruiting someone you know. So that's convenience and accidental sampling. But that's not only ideal, but that's one thing you might want to avoid to make your user study more valid, I would say.
Don't we have to use people in the lab for when we do analysis?
Sorry?
I was told that we wouldn't be able to have time to go out and find certain music or doing our own pieces. That it's better to use with the students. Is that okay?
So again, might be like if you're, for example, if your user interface is designed for your case for medical expert or somebody, it's ideal to have some of those to get involved in your user study. But if because of certain constraints, such as not easy to get like 10 or 20 people or of them as to come and do the user study here, you might want to kind of do a small study with them, like might do some qualitative study with them, and then if it's you can design your user study to focus on certain things that might not require medical expertise, and do some of those representative tasks, focus on those representative tasks in your user study. For instance, if you designed an alternative user interface and you're focusing on improving the time they go through certain menu items, then that might be some of course, the final product will be used by the experts, medical experts, but the design itself of the user interface could be somehow isolated and tested by itself. So you might need to design your user study in that way, so that you could test against just general people in some ways. But still, it's an alternative to, instead of having the actual medical experts in your user study. But since there are certain constraints, of course, you'll have to have certain logic in your report saying these were the constraints. So you ended up using this kind of participants as an alternative. But even then, maybe you might want to wisely choose the participants so that could be representative of the medical experts, such as you might not want to recruit high school students, or someone might have quite different background from the medical doctors, but better a little bit more those who have more expertise in certain areas, such as college graduates or so forth. So anyway, it's possible to kind of target for an alternative group of users, but ideally it's more better to have the actual end users involved in your user study. So how to recruit participants? You can, if you are targeting general public, then you could be a little bit more active by advertising on a paper or college bulletin board or something. So time to time you might see some posters on our entrance of our lab, and some of the students also put those posters around the university to recruit people at the bus stops and so forth, to recruit some participants. So you can do those kinds of advertisements, or you can, if there's some mailing list you can use, then you can mail out to recruit some participants and so forth. So again, it will depend on what kind of participants you are targeting to recruit. And for qualitative studies, or especially ethnographic studies, since you are going to get more closely involved with your human participants, it's will usually take longer time to recruit as well, rather than just asking people to come to the lab for an hour and do a user experiment. It will usually end up with building relationship with them when you're doing qualitative studies. So you will take longer time to actually get those kind of participants. And of course, it might not be easy to just ask random people to spend their time without anything. So it might be good if you can think of some kind of incentives, such as at the lab we usually support some vouchers, such as coffee vouchers around the cafe around the university, so that we could encourage people to come to participate in the user study. Sometimes the user interface itself can be quite attractive, such as some of the studies which were involving some Google Glasses. Then you can promote that as an incentive. You can have a chance to try Google Glass and so forth. So those could be also some way to lure people to participate in your user study. And of course, it's also good to, if you are doing some longer term user studies, and you might want to have a pool of users that you can recruit, then might be also a good idea to build a kind of database or a pool of people. Of course, when you're doing this, of course, you might want to ask for them to agree that you're collecting those kind of information. And so those are those are the things that you might want to remind when you are recruiting your participants. And once the participants participate in your study, it's also important to make sure that you yourself also, but also the participant themselves, know what are their rights during the experiment. So these are the rights of the participants. They have a right to know the goals of the study. Of course, some of the studies you might want to you might want to prevent them knowing the final goals at the beginning of your user study while they are doing certain tasks. So you might start with not exposing the final goals of your user study at the beginning, but at least at the end, if they're interested, you should be able to tell them what were your intentions with doing this kind of study. Sorry? Access of the results of the study, and so they should be able to ask you questions about the user study. So you have to be able to tell them. Of course, again, if it was the intention that you don't want to really tell them about the final goals while they are doing the task in the user study, you might be able to tell them because it might influence the study. I will tell you those at the end of the study, once you're done your user study and so forth. So you can kind of rearrange the order that you do, but at least the participants might have the right to know about the study and so forth. And they should be able to know what will happen to the findings. So usually you will say that it will end up in your master thesis or your conference publication and so forth. So in many cases, they're not much considered how these things will end up, but some of the participants might be curious, and especially when they are concerned with privacy issues. So if the final results is going to be reporting his picture or her picture or with certain information, then that might be quite a concern. So yeah, we will have to have a consent for that, of course. So they might ask how these results will be gathered, and of course, most of the cases you can tell them it will be aggregated into a statistical number, so it might not be pinpointing each individuals and so forth. So you can tell those. And the third one, privacy of the personal information, of course, should be kept. And the one thing that's usually ignored is they should be able to leave when they wish. So even when they decided to participate and when they were half through, of course, it's quite a pity to have someone half through the experiment and quit in the middle, but that's still the right of the participants. So you should let them know that they can quit whenever they want, and should be able to do that. And of course, you should treat them politely. And so the mindset you have to remind yourself is you're testing your solution and your prototype, but not your user. So you cannot really force them to do certain things that they are doing wrong, but might not be. But you should think that the reason why they're doing certain things wrong is not because they're wrong, but it's more because of your prototype has certain problems. So you should be always thinking that you're testing your solution or your user interface, not the users. Okay, and to make this all kind of these kind of things that you have to take care of into one piece is usually you end up with forming an informed consent, which is a kind of piece of paper that describes what is your study about and all those information, the participants' rights and so forth in a written form, and hand them out or let them read those through before they participate. And at the end, it's not only enough to just let them have that piece of paper and read them through, but it's always important that you have a agreement from the participant that they agree with participating in the study. So informed consent consists of two parts. Again, it's informing the participants to understand what's the study about and what kind of procedures they will be going through, and if there is some protection risk, such as if you're doing some study outside, then you might maybe want to warn them about some risk when you're close to the roadside, be aware of the cars and so forth. So you might want to inform those things. And also you might need to include some information, how to get more information, such as after when they finished the study and went back home, then they might want to contact yourself or someone at the lab. So you might need to include those kind of information as well. And as a consent part, participants should be voluntarily participating in the study, so it shouldn't be forced. Some cases, you might, in case you are, some cases such as, which is not good example, but bad example is some of the courses or some of the lecturers usually ask students to participate in a certain study to complete their grades in their lectures, but that's totally wrong because of it's kind of forcing them to participate in the study. So you shouldn't do that. And of course, it's you might have a part of your informed consent asking them to write down their name or sign as an act of saying that they are agreeing with participating in the study. So these are some informations you might consider or want to include in the informed consent, some title, purpose, and so forth, how long it will take, what kind of risk or benefits they will have, and how you'll be taking care of your user information, so how you will take care of the privacy, make sure the privacy is not breached, and also what kind of participant rights they have, and some contact information so that they can ask some questions later on, and so forth. And if you're going to take photos or video recordings of the participants, then you'll have to make sure the participants is aware of it and they have agreed about that. And some of the risk we can think of. So if your user experiments involve some kind of physical stress, then you might have to think of what kind of physical safety you might want to have. So in some cases, if you're going to measure how stressful it is for your arm, then you might want to carefully think of if a level of stress is is a concern in terms of medical issue. It could be a medical issue or so forth. So you might need to warn them that you might experience some strain in your arm or at the end of your study or so forth. And again, if you're doing some study outside, or if the study involves certain activities with amount of motions or walking around, then you might want to warn them about obstacles and so forth. And besides the physical problems, it could be also a mental problem as well. So some of the tasks that you're doing could be quite mentally stressful for the users. So if the tasks you are using in your user study are those cases, then maybe you'll have to also ask them in advance. So those people who are very weak for motion sickness, for example, you might want to ask them if they have certain health issues with those kind of concerns before you actually get them into your user study and so forth. So privacy is another big thing that you might need to consider treating the collected results, of course. So first of all, you have to have an agreement from your user about agreeing that you're collecting those kind of information and storing it for a certain amount of time and how you're going to treat it. And of course, you'll have to always limit the amount of information you collect. So please don't collect unnecessary information, such as with the questionnaire, you can always avoid asking them to write down their name and so forth, so that you can decouple the personal information from the outcome of the user study and so forth. And of course, you'll have to store them in a secure way and make sure that those information are only available to certain amount of people. It's always safe if you just make sure you treat them only by yourself or just small amount of people, rather than sharing it with many people, so forth. And again, photography, audio, or video recording, you should pay more attention with privacy issues. And with the consent part, participants should state or agree to that they have volunteered and not forced to participate in the study, and they have been informed about the study, about the tasks and procedures they're going through, and they've had a chance to ask questions either at the beginning or at the end of the study, and they are aware of any risks or problems they might face during the experiment and so forth. And you ask them to sign the form that saying that they agree to these terms and so forth. And of course, you'll have to provide a copy of those with the contact information so that they could ask questions later on. So at the University of Canterbury, they have a committee that carefully looks after these kind of problems or these kind of regulations or these kind of procedures that you do with user study. So and by the regulation in the university, the rule in the university is to go through a review by the Human Ethics Committee about your user study design and your user study plan. So, and you can find more details in this URL. So if you go to their website, they will have a form or a sample that they ask for. So the form will include what kind of your user study design, what kind of intended participants you're going to recruit, and so forth. So you'll have to fill in your form and attach sometimes might be also need to what kind of questionnaire you are using and so forth. So, and then you submit it to the committee, and then they will review it and get back to you. And then once you have the approval from the committee, then that's a goal for your user study. And if they find some concerns in terms of privacy issues or ethical issues, then they will give you feedback to correct those in your user studies design. So, and of course, this is not only to protect the participants per se, but it's also to protect the researchers yourselves and the university as well. Because without this kind of reviewing process, you cannot guarantee that you might be sued by a certain participant afterwards. So it's a kind of safety way to get your study reviewed by the committee before you conduct it. Not in terms of only for the participants, but it's also to make sure you're on the right track and you don't get into troubles later on.
And how long does
usually it takes about, I think for your case, which is for master's thesis, you can put it into a kind of they have a certain category saying low risk category of user studies, and I think it qualifies if it's a part of your master's thesis. So in that case, usually it takes like 1 or 2 weeks maximum, but it could take longer if your study involves some kind of certain issues such as safety issues and so forth. If that's the case, then it might take a little bit longer. But usually the turnaround time is about 1 week or 2.
Introduction takes quite a while.
So again, the important thing is that you are aware of this process exists in the university. So you might want to think of this before you plan for your user study, so that
it means Human Ethics Committee, does it?
Sorry? Yeah, HEC means Human Ethics Committee. Here, Human Ethics Committee at UC. Yeah. So that was the latter part of what we talked last week. So these are the chapters. Of course, you might have already had a look, but these are the chapters related to the subjects I've talked today and some of the subjects I talked last week. So please feel free to refer to these chapters and read them if you want to know a little bit more details. And there are some chapters that has some more details about how to, in case your participants, if you are targeting some participants that require some impairments, such as if you're designing a user interface for blind people, then you might want to also read some of the chapter 15 so that it will give you some more of the guideline that you might have to concern while you're designing your user study and so forth. And so that was the latter part of last week. And maybe we'll have a quick 5-minute break and go to the usability testing part of lecture. Or if you're fine to just continue on? Yeah? All right, we'll just continue on then. Sometimes too easier. So yep, there we go. So today we're going to talk about usability testing. Is one of the methods that you do HCI research, but in some sense, usability testing is a little bit more of industrial method rather than academic method that you do HCI research. So we'll go into a little bit more details as we go on. But anyway, we're talking about this method up front because it could be quite informative in terms of looking into the term usability itself, which is one of the main things that you investigate in human-computer interface field. But in contrast, usability testing itself is a little bit different from what you do or expect from academic research, which is more focusing on the final product. So the purpose of the usability study is to make sure the end product meets the standards for the usability, and the purpose is more to make sure your product is so to say usable enough to release. But it's it has a slightly different focus from academic research, which looks into more discovering new knowledge. So anyway, usability, ISO defines usability as like this. Usability is known as an extent to which a product or a human interface, in our case, can be used by specific users to achieve specific goals with effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction in a specified context of use. So usability, as the words implies, it's about how usable it is and how well the end user can use this product or user interface. And by using, you mean achieving certain goals. By using your tool, they want to have certain tasks to be done, so you're using your user interface and to do those. And there are three kind of aspects of the usability. One is effectiveness, how user could actually achieve the goal. So if, for instance, if your user interface is maybe you can take a example of a hammer. So your task is to put that nail on your wall. So you can use a hammer or a book or whatever you can hold. So those all could be effective, which in terms of achieving your goal, putting the nail onto a piece of wood, that could be effective, but might not be efficient. It might take more of an effort. So that's so usability looks into both of them. So it should be effective and efficient, and also not only effective and efficient in terms of the performance of the user, but it also looks into the satisfaction of the user. So how much they liked or they were satisfied by using that interface. So those are the three main phases of the usability, I would say. And if you kind of look into a little bit more details of those aspects, you can think of these categories or aspects of the usability. So these are the aspects of the usability that many of the people look into. The first one is learnability, which is how easy is it the users to learn how to use your interface. So when the people first encounter your interface, how easy is it for them to actually know how to use it or how to do a certain test with your user interface and so forth. And the second category is, of course, efficiency, how efficiently they can perform the task, how less amount of menu they have to go through, or how less amount of button they have to click to do certain tasks and so forth. So it's about efficiency, and of course efficiency many times involves time issue. So how less time they could take, or how less amount of user interaction they have to, or subtext they have to do certain tests and so forth. And third one is memorability, which is how it kind of goes related with the learnability, which is about how intuitive is the design so that they can learn fast. And memorability is how they can keep their knowledge afterwards. So as written here, when user returns to the design or your user interface, how easily they can remember how they had to use and how they had to do the task and so forth. And the fourth aspect is errors, how many errors users make and how much your user is prone to the errors, how they can recover from the errors, or how it prevents making errors, such as when you close your window, and does it by error, then does it allow you to recover from it, or how does it prevent from closing the windows before saving it and so forth. So those are aspects of errors. And satisfaction is how pleasant or how they like it, how they find it nicely designed. It also includes some aesthetics aspects of the user interface as well. So those are common aspects of usability they look into. And so that's usability, and I'm pretty sure you're hear quite a lot of times referring to how the usability of an interface was, and of course HCI research is focusing on how to make the user interface usable and increasing the usability of the interface. But there's also a term called usability testing, and again, this is quite a form of test which is quite focused on industrial part, or from the industry field or commercial field of the HCI, which is focusing on to check the usability of the final product and your prototype to make sure it's good enough to be released in the market. And the purpose of this usability testing is to identify and fix the flaws of your product, of course. But it's less about discovering new knowledge, which is more of a focus of an academic field of HCI research. So we'll talk all about the difference between usability testing and HCI research later on, but maybe we'll go a little bit more detail about how usability testing are done and so forth. So to make sure your product or your user interface design is usable, there are three main approaches, which is quite similar to HCI research methods. First one is user-based testing. So of course, you get some users and let them use your user interface and find out some problems they had while using them so that you can fix them and make sure your product is free of those problems. And the second way is to involve experts who are aware of certain heuristic rules of HCI design and go try your user interface and see if some of the designs violate those heuristic rules and so forth. And the third is automated testing, which is involving some software tools. And some of the examples are in software development tools. Sometimes they also give you warnings about the font size. So if you use too small font size, then it's not about functional issues, but some of the software design tools gives you feedback. This font size might be hard to read or so forth. And those are an example of software tools that automatically test usability issues. But of course, there are limitations with this. So you usually end up with user-based testing or expert-based testing at least. But at the first stage of while you are still doing your design with a software tool, then some of the software tool gives you some feedbacks with the usability issues. And I think Android IDE does some of this when you lay out your screen. It gives you some feedback. So expert-based testing is again, it's to have some experts who are aware of certain heuristic rules about usability issues and who are very aware of those, so that they can, once they use a certain prototype, they can pick out some of the aspects of your design which are violating some of those rules. So and usually it's more useful if you do this before you test against the user, because expert-based testing is picking out those obvious problems that's based on the heuristic rules for good design. So it's always better to have this before you do the user testing, because if it's the other way around, then you might have get quite a lot of troubles with the users, and then once you fix those, then you might get less output from the expert-based testing. So with the experts, they usually use heuristic rules or heuristic evaluations. So they inspect the interface based on the heuristic rules, And usually you can, of course, do it a small set of evaluators. You don't need like 10 or dozens of experts. But if that person is expert enough with knowing the rules, then you can just have 1 or 2 people to evaluate your. So with heuristic evaluation, they will have a set of heuristic rules, and they will identify the problems and identify what rule it violates, and so forth. So, and as you go through, of course, if you have always safer to have more than 1 people to test your product, even if he's an expert, because some of some of the problems might have been not aware of an expert. So it's the advantage of using heuristic evaluation is it's relatively quick, because the expert might know quite well about the rules and might not require to repeat the whole thing, but just once he went through the whole test, then he might be able to identify the problems quickly. And you can obtain the feedback from the early stage of your design process. So even if with the sketches, you can show it to the experts and get some feedbacks about your design and so forth. And of course, it helps you correct the problems. The disadvantage requires a certain level of knowledge. So you have to have someone who knows well about those heuristic rules and who are used to picking out those problems when they're looking at a user interface. So should be someone who is trained to do those kind of tasks. And some cases they might have some different terms they are using, so might be different from what users are saying. So those are some pitfalls that you might have to avoid and so forth. And since they are based on these kind of heuristic rules, it might be kind of a high level problem they can pick, but those which are not in these heuristic rules could be missed off. So it's not always perfect. So there's a limitation in terms of what kind of heuristic rules he was thinking of and so forth. So these are some of the heuristic rules, examples of heuristic rules. This is 10 interface heuristic rules proposed by Nielsen, who is again one of the big names in usability testing. And it involves visibility of system status, which means the user should be aware of what kind of status he is in. So, for instance, when you are in a Word document, you should be aware of the caps lock is turned on or off, and so forth, or more with the password typing or so forth, and match between the system and the real world, and so forth. So I won't be going through all of the details of this rule, so maybe just have a read of those rules by yourself later on. So I'll just skip those. So these are some examples of the rules. Another way of experts testing your user interface design is to go through a cognitive walkthrough, which means user will go through a certain sub steps of doing a task. So for instance, when you have to press a button to do, for instance, when you are going to change the style of your paragraph in your Word document, then you'll go through thinking of going to find a button that does the style from this tab, and then so you go step by step wise and thinking what the user's mental behavior will be. So while doing each step of the subtask, he will go through asking these questions, such as first, does the user know what kind of subtask he has to do, such as when you are changing the style of the paragraph, the subtext will be pressing a button, pressing the tab that has the styles menu, and then looking for the button that the style that he wants to apply, and so forth. So that could be one question he himself will be asking. And the other question might be, will the user notice that the correct action is available, such as is the button visible that changes the style, so forth. And the third question will be, will the user associate the correct action with the effect to be achieved? So such as if the button says bold, then could be like the button could say bold, but it could be just a B letter on the button. So user might know that what will happen after pressing the button or not. So you'll be asking this question: is it the button saying enough about what will happen afterwards, and so forth? And if the correction action is performed, will the user see the progress? Once that button is pressed, will user see letter changing into bold? Or if it's a text that's taking some time, then will the user see the progress bar, and so forth? So it's a set of questions that you ask while you do a subset of tests that you have to do. So it's a kind of a method they go through, thinking of the subtask and asking these questions about each subtask and trying to see if there's any problem of the user interface. So those are the two main ways the expert use when they test your user interface as an expert. And of course, once you've done, they will make a report saying these are the problems. Some of them are violating the heuristic rules of the good user interface, or they will identify some of the subtasks was hard to know which button was which, or so forth, based on the cognitive walkthrough. Sorry?
Sometimes the users are wrong.
Sometimes the users are wrong. Yeah, of course. Sometimes the users are wrong, but
Not always.
but what wrong? Yeah, what wrong could be like.
They don't understand the flow of how it's like works.
So the users are wrong in terms of they might say something in a different way. So might be a problem A, but they might be telling another thing about the problem. So they might be not aware of that underlying problem. So they could be wrong in terms of that. But in terms of there is a problem, in terms of in terms of when user says there is a problem, it's nothing wrong with saying that it's nothing wrong about saying there is a problem. I mean, certainly there is a problem when user says there is a problem. It could be the problem the user says, but might be another problem that causing that one. But certainly there is a problem, and you cannot really kind of ignore what they're saying, of course. Yeah. So usability testing also could be done based on user, of course. So you set representative users that represents your end user population, and then you ask them to perform a set of representative tests that you expect to do with your user interface, and then you identify, watch them, observe them, and see what they are having any troubles with doing certain tasks, or does it take longer than expected, or are they pushing the wrong button, and so forth. So in many cases, it involves with observing the user or measuring certain measures such as test completion time or number of errors they did, and so forth. And this is not only done once your working prototype is available. It could be also still done with your paper sketch or so forth, such as asking which so with a paper prototypes, you can still ask them to do certain tasks, such as try to see if you can press a button or to do certain tasks or so forth, and watch them which button they pick and sort of things. Of course, it might not be as complete as having a final or working prototype, but could be still done at the early stage of your designing. And it's also important that you have this at the early stage of your design, because the purpose is to fix the design issues. It makes more sense to do it at the early stage of your design when you still can fix the design. So when you do it at the very later part of your design process, then there will be lesser chance to fix those problems because of the time limit. Or did you have it?
I was going to ask, with the usability testing, you said that you get an expert in. If you're doing early prototypes like on paper, is it a good idea to get expert paper early on?
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be an actual system.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be an actual system. So both for expert and users, it doesn't have to be a working system, but you still can have a sketch and either ask the user or an expert to try to see if you have a new design of a web browser, and then you can sketch it, have some text field and some buttons, and show it to them, and so say them this is a new browser I'm making, and see what would you press if you want to go to the back page, then see if they press the correct button, or if you are experimenting from slider to go forth and back the history, then maybe you can see if that slider looks obvious enough for the user or the expert. So you can still test them both with user or expert. So I think we've talked a little bit about formative testing and summative testing and so forth. It also applies to the usability testing as well. So at the early stage, you can still use some low fidelity prototypes such as paper-based sketching and so forth, and do some testing. And at the early stage of your test, when your prototypes are not fully functional, one trick you can think of is one method that are used is called Wizard of Oz, which is based on the novel. Wizard of Oz. Yeah, and it's about having your prototype might not be fully functional, but just a static screens. But what you can do is you have a human wizard at the background. So when you can ask people to tap or press the button you want to press in your screen. Then once they press, you swap out the paper, or if it's a slideshow, then you can skip to the slide which shows what happens next and so forth. So you can still do those kind of testing at the early stage. Of course, this is when you're doing Wizard of Oz, your focus shouldn't be task performance, such as how fast they did and especially how fast they did shouldn't be tested with this kind of technique. But you can still test, such as did people get the right button? Did people knew what that button will do next, and so forth? Is the workflow ordered in the correct way, and so forth? You can still test them with Wizard of Oz or paper-based prototype. And so once you've done some of those, you can go through summative testing, which is testing some of the design choices. I think we've talked about this formative testing, summative testing, and so forth earlier, so I'll just go through. And coming back to how many users do you need with the usability testing, which is the purpose, again, to remind you, with the purpose of the usability testing is to find the problems of your product or your interface. So in this case, Nielsen usually insists, or he says, based on his experience, says 5 users finds most of the problems, which is he draws these kind of graphs. But unfortunately, these graphs are not based on scientific research. So this is based on what his experience. But still, as you can see from this graph, he says usually this is a number of evaluators, could be users or experts, and this is the percentage of problems found. So he says once it's past the first 5 users or evaluator finds like almost 80% of the problem, and then afterwards, of course, you can easily expect, even if you have more people, they will find the same problems anyway, and then might be a small chance they find new problems that wasn't found with the 5 people. So, and another graph shows this is again the number of evaluators, and thinking of your effort in terms of time and cost that you need to recruit more people. So, so you can draw kind of graph that usually the efficiency is maximized at having 5 people, of course, because it slows down finding new problems. But again, this is not about 5 users finding out all of the problems. It's just saying 5 people finds most of the problems, so there should be still a problem left behind. So of course, it's again, if you have more users, there is a chance that another user will find some of the problems that wasn't identified at the early stage. But still, that's how Nielsen says about how many people you might need to do usability testing to find major flaws of your user interface design. So again, that number is based on the purpose. Thinking of the goal of the usability test is to find the major flaws of your interface. So, and again, this is focusing on the commercial part of the human-computer interface design, which is trying to find the major flaws before they release the product and making it validated. And so this is a typical picture of a usability testing laboratory, where they usually have a half mirror and have a participant inside this room and let them use the user interface. And while the experts are watching behind, seeing what kind of mistakes they are making, what kind of problems they go through, and sometimes record how fast they completed the task or how many times they had with error, or some logging some user interactions, how many mouse clicks they had, and so forth. So it's quite similar to the methods that we use for academic research as well. But again, the focus is on picking the problems that the user interface design has. Sometimes they also do some remote usability testing, such as not in this kind of laboratory testing, but also at the workplace, at the office or home, and might have some logging software running in the background so that they could log the user interaction and analyze it later on. Or they also sell some products such as doing remote usability testing, which is basically a remote conferencing system that you can put some cameras around the user and record them. But anyway, these are the tools that, just to let you know, there are those kind of tools, but most of the cases based on fixed usability laboratory. And again, while you do the usability testing, it's important to create a set of tasks so that user will be goal-oriented with the final goal that the task that they have to finish. So, and while you write up this test, you should be clear, of course, and clear about what they have to do and what they have to achieve at the end of the final task, and so forth. And one thing you'll have to make sure while describing this task is you'll have to make sure the task can be only completed by using the user interface, not by cheating. So if you leave out those kind of things, then there might be a chance that you end up not testing your interface, but testing a shortcut to the task without using your interface. And of course, you should be clear with the instruction. If there is a certain order they have to do, you should mention those. Or if there is certain tests that they have to go through, not to skip, then also mention those. Do certain tests require other? It's again saying about the order. If there could be some cases that user might give up at the middle of doing a test. Well, when they are stuck with they cannot figure it out at all which button to press, then you might have to think of that kind of cases in advance, what to do in that case, and know what to do, and tell the user what to do in that case, such as, are you going to move on to the next task straight on, or are you going to ask the experimenter how to do that, or so forth. So you should decide those things in advance and plan those things in advance. So usually the measurements of usability testing are quantitative, such as, so it's based on how user can easily complete the task, or how fast they can complete the test. So usually it involves task performance, such as time they took or how many errors they made and so forth. So those are the main measures you usually look at. But still, you can still involve some qualitative observations. Thinking of usability is not only about effectiveness and efficiency, but also user satisfaction. So some of the qualitative observations could be also helpful, such as how much frustrated was the users while they were using it. You can easily observe those, or you can observe them if they are lost or something like that. And one way to easily collect some subjective or qualitative feedbacks is to ask them to think aloud. I think we've briefly mentioned this method before, to let them verbally say what they are thinking while they are doing the task. But again, it might be a little bit tricky, and sometimes they might feel uncomfortable, so might choose to use this carefully depending on what kind of task you are testing, so forth. So instead of, an alternative is a reflection section. Instead of asking them to think aloud while they are doing the test, you can ask them later on. Once they finish the test, you can ask the question later on, or ask them to reflect what they have been doing while they were using the test, and tell you afterwards. So that could be an alternative rather than asking them to speak out while they're doing things. So while you're testing, again, decide in advance how to handle some exceptions, such as when user is stuck, well, what you're going to do. Are you going to give penalty of certain amount of time and then tell them how to do it? Or are you going to stop the experiment? Or are you going to move on to the next test, leaving out the previous test and so forth? So you should decide in advance. Otherwise, you will be not consistent. But if you're measuring, but in terms of your goal is to pick as much as problem out of the user interface, you can decide just to tell them how to do that, because once that problem is identified, it's no harm to just tell them how to do that and move on to find the other problems as well. So saying that the purpose of this usability testing is to pick up as much as, the problems as much as possible and fix them. So it's no harm to just move on or tell them how to do that. But of course, you'll have to make note that there was a problem with this, instead of just moving on and forgetting about that problem. So, and of course, you'll have to make sure to encourage participants to give your feedback to you, and in that way you could encourage the participant that you're not interested in how, you're not looking into how fast the participant, I mean, you're not testing the participant, but the user interface, and you can also encourage them by telling you're picking the problems. You're trying to find the problems. So if you are stuck or if you are having a problem with the user interface, it's not your wrong, but the user interface that might be the problem that we are looking for. So you can encourage participants to report back the problems they have in that way. So once you've finished, you can collect the data and summarize them. Usually, usability study is not about comparing different alternatives or methods and comparing them, but in many cases it's picking the problem and trying to see if that meets the final product's requirement. So usually you won't use inferential statistics, which is comparing different conditions when you're doing formal user experiment. But it's more, you might end up using descriptive statistics, which is mean time they had, mean or variance of the time or error, number of errors they collect when the users during the usability study. And of course, you'll have to write up the report for each of the flow you found, the problems you found, and describe the problem and present some data. If you had, like, you measured the time or so forth, you present the data. And of course, since the purpose of the usability testing is to not only find the problem, but to fix it afterwards, you can suggest how to fix them. And in some case, if you could go furthermore, you can prioritize the problems, which is the more important one and which could be left out if we end up with not having enough time to fix all of them. So that's, again, the focus of the whole usability study is to find the problem and to fix it in the next iteration.
When you do your usability study, when you're saying like find the flaws, I know when you write your thesis, you're writing a solution for your research question. But do people write papers on actually testing their systems and saying this was a current system, these are the problems we have?
Okay, so that's why I mentioned usability testing is usually not an academically focused method that you test your user interface design. So it's focused on industrial worth of doing this testing and making sure there is no problem before they release. So usually after the usability testing, you don't end up with writing this report as an academic paper, but it's more the end report is kind of giving a feedback to improve the product itself. So, sorry? You're adding value, of course. So again, although I've showed, I mean, today's lecture covered about the usability testing. It's a high chance that you might not be doing the usability itself for your master's thesis, but you might be using some of the techniques that usability testing use, such as Wizard of Oz. You can still do that with your early prototype, and if you have a design choices, then you can use that as a tool to design your user interface with less problem. So you can think of usability study as a tool that you make your interface design more complete or flawless, but it's not a tool that you end up with research answers. So actually, the next slide I think will give you a little bit more clear idea. So this slide is kind of summing up what happens when you are developing a product and doing usability testing. At the first stage, you will do what kind of task you will want the user to do with your user interface. And maybe at the early stage, you will ask the experts and test against the heuristic rules if your design has any violations with those rules. And the third phase, you might have some formative evaluation with some working prototypes. And if you have a working prototype, then you might run some usability studies, usability tests against the users and pick some problems and so forth. So that's a kind of streamline of how the whole usability testing goes. And maybe this slide might answer your question, which is, so usability testing and HCI research, it has a common things, and it's also different in some aspects. And the main difference, the common thing is the method used in usability testing and research can be quite the same, such as observation, key logging, or asking people to do certain predefined tasks and so forth, and measure their task performance or collect some questionnaire and so forth. So the tools that you use in usability testing could be used in HCI research as well. But the main difference is the goal of the usability testing compared to the research. So while the goal of the usability testing is to find the problem in your user interface and try to fix them, research are more on based on research questions you had earlier. So that's the main difference between the research and the usability testing. And in terms of your master thesis, which is an academic research, it might not be, it's not about saying your prototype had this problem and you fixed it, but it's more about if the underlying idea of your design makes a difference from the previous solution. So in that sense, usability testing usually doesn't include multiple conditions to compare with, but just test the user interface you design and try to find the problems you're having. And this table kind of highlights what are the difference between the two. So usability testing, although both are looking into how usable is your interface, usability testing is to improve your product or your single design itself. But experimental research or HCI research is more focusing on discovering knowledge, such as would new style of interaction improve the usability and so forth. So both are trying to improve the usability of your product, but usability testing is focusing on your single product and trying to improve it as is. And experimental research is trying to look into more comparing the state of the art against your new idea. Okay? And usability testing, since the purpose is to pick as much as problem out as possible, so as we've talked a little bit earlier about saying maybe 5 people will pick out most of the problems, so it usually involves less participants, but experimental research, which is comparing the state of the art with your new idea, usually needs a statistical conclusion to make. So usually to make those kind of general conclusions, you will end up having more participants. And usually usability testing might not be completely replicable because the status of that user interface you were testing is actually not the final product you are doing, but kind of interim product that you are trying to fix the problems. So the purpose of the testing is not to replicate the test later on, but to improve the product and move on. But in comparison, experimental research should be repeatable because of the purpose of experimental research is to prove that it's could be generalized in other situations as well. Okay.
So with earlier on you mentioned that they both have the same, you can use the same method
Same
for both of them. So in that case, like replicating the experimental research, when you talk to users, for example, you get this information from the sample. The sample, the participants, you get specific information. Is it still replicable, like later on when you want to, or when somebody else wants to get information? Is that what you meant by the replicable?
Replicable means you can think it as a in terms of generalizable thing. So if you said if your research idea was adding voice command to say Google Glass, you say you have a research topic saying adding voice commands makes it easier to use Google wearable computers, then you might have done an experimental study comparing recruiting people and so forth, and done a study, and from your study you concluded adding voice command was improved the usability. But saying that study was replicable is saying that not saying that you recruit the same person and use the same prototype. That's not the case, but it's about if you have the similar case where you had another type of wearable device and you had one without the voice command and one with the voice command, and you recruited similar populations of the users in your study and run the study, then replicable means you might have the similar results from the previous study. Okay, so it's not about replicating the study exactly as it was, but it's more of focusing on comparing the two things. In a similar situation, it always comes with the same results. And
Is that to take into account when you're doing usability testing that you're improving the product?
sorry?
So you said it must be applicable. Is that because when you're doing your thesis or you're working on your product or your idea, you're updating it? So because you're updating it, you're going to be doing similar tasks again? Is that what you mean by replicable?
No. So replicable here means so usability testings are usually not replicable because of the focus of the usability testing was not to compare two approaches and conclude something which could be generalized, but it's more of focusing on this specific case. So in terms of so since the purpose is to pick the problems and fix those problems, it's just one instance that you are doing, and there's no point having that problematic product and do it again later on.
Okay, so you do usability testing before you do your experiment?
Yeah, usually, it's a good idea to do the usability testing to make your design have not having any usability problems, and then you can. So, for instance, again, back to the voice recognition. If your product had kind of your voice recognition program was very crude and doesn't recognize that voice well, and even with some of the representative comments that you might want to include in your product, then it's a good idea to do the usability testing first to see if your product is up to the level that you initially designed it for with the design requirement, so that you can make sure it's at least doesn't have the obvious usability problems, and then later on then you can do experimental research comparing having a voice command and without it, and saying that voice command actually improves the usability or user performance. And so. Okay, so if you want to study more, chapter 10 of the book Research Methods in HCI is what my slides are based on, so you can have a read on that one. And next week we'll now go into details of other methods such as survey. And if you are interested, you can have a read on chapter 5, which talks about the survey, and that will. And this week I don't have any assignments for this week, so does that give you some relief? So you have some. Okay, so you have big things to do with Krista. Okay. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a little bit more relief with doing assignments for the other two lectures.
Okay. Let me stop this recording.